William McNeil had been tracking the wheel marks for nearly 2 miles when they suddenly veered off the road. It was just past 8 a.m. on a December morning in 1898, and already the Queensland heat was building, that particular oppressive stillness that comes before the sun reaches its full fury. He recognised those tracks immediately. One wheel had a distinctive wobble, a defect he knew well because it was his sulky, his 2-wheel horse-drawn cart that his brother-in-law Michael Murphy had borrowed the previous evening. Michael had taken his sisters to a dance in Gatton. They should have been home hours ago. McNeil guided his horse through the gap and into Moran's paddock. The tracks continued through wattle scrub and long grass deeper into the field. He called out, his voice carrying across the empty landscape, but there was no answer. And then he saw them, 3 figures in the grass, perhaps 50 yards ahead. They were lying down, still. McNeil's first thought, the one the mind reaches for when confronted with something it doesn't want to understand, was that they must be sleeping. Perhaps they'd stopped to rest on the way home. Perhaps they'd had too much to drink at the dance. But as he drew closer, walking his horse slowly forward, details began to register that didn't fit that comfortable narrative. The stillness was too complete, the positions too awkward, and the sulky stood at an angle nearby, the horse still in its traces. McNeil dismounted. He walked towards the closest figure, Michael, lying on his back in a good suit, and that's when he saw them. Ants. Not just a few, thousands of them, streaming across Michael's face, across his open eyes, in and out of his mouth. The same horror repeated on Ellen, lying just feet away. And there, farther off, on a rug that had been carefully spread on the ground, Norah. The ants moved with that relentless purpose that ants have, oblivious to the enormity of what they were crawling over. And in that moment, William McNeil understood. They weren't sleeping. His brother-in-law and sisters-in-law were dead, and someone had arranged them here with terrible precision. Michael and Ellen back to back. Norah exactly 28 feet to the east, all 3 with their legs positioned so their feet pointed west. The women's hands were tied behind their backs. The horse that had pulled them there had been shot through the head. McNeil stood in that paddock as the Queensland sun climbed ever higher, trying to comprehend what his eyes were now showing him. The brutality was obvious, skulls crushed, blood everywhere, the women's clothing torn, but it was the staging that made his skin crawl. That careful positioning, the neat rug, the deliberate arrangement of bodies like pieces on a board. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't an accident or a fight gone wrong. Someone had done this. Someone had taken the time after committing murder to arrange their victims into a pattern that, more than a century later, we still can't explain. This is what William McNeil discovered on the morning of December 27, 1898. This is the crime scene that will become known as the Gatton Tragedy, Australia's most baffling and perhaps gruesome unsolved murder. The feet pointing west, the careful spacing, the ritualistic precision. What did it mean? Who would do such a horrible thing? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why? Welcome to Strewth, a podcast about Australia's strangest mysteries. I'm your host, and today we're travelling to a small farming community in colonial Queensland, to a crime scene so bizarre, so meticulously staged, and so brutally executed that it would haunt a nation for over a century. Welcome to the story of the Gatton Tragedy. The year is 1898. The 20th century hovers just beyond the horizon. The Commonwealth of Australia exists only as an idea, a dream of federation still being debated in colonial parliaments. In Queensland, sugar plantations still employ thousands of indentured labourers from the South Pacific, which, to be frank, is just a diplomatic way of saying slaves. And the divisions between Catholic Irish immigrants and the Protestant English establishment run as deep as the red soil itself. Gatton is a town of 449 souls, perched on the road between Brisbane and the Darling Downs. It's a place where 2 major bridges and a railway line promise progress, where the future seems to shimmer in the summer heat. But it's still small enough that everyone knows everyone else's business, or at least thinks they do. The Murphy family farm sits at Blackfellows Creek, about 8 miles from town. 300 acres of green pasture and dairy cattle, carved from the bush by 2 Irish immigrants who arrived in Queensland in the 1860s with nothing but determination and dreams of respectability. Daniel Murphy Sr. had fled the grinding poverty of famine-era Ireland, where starvation was a neighbour and hope a luxury. He found work building the railway line between Ipswich and Toowoomba, his hands hardening with each spike driven into the earth. Somewhere along that line, he met Mary Holland, most likely working as a domestic servant, another Irish refugee seeking something better than what they'd left behind. They married in about 1866 and began what would become a family of 10 children. By Christmas 1898, when our story begins, 8 of those children still lived at home in their 5-room cottage, a testament to both the closeness of the family and perhaps something else, something the neighbours might whisper about when the Murphys weren't listening. Christmas Day 1898 was a joyous affair. The entire Murphy clan, minus Daniel Jr., who was back in Brisbane working as a police constable, attended Christmas Mass. Neighbours would later recall seeing them in high spirits, laughing, the younger children excited by the rare holiday festivities. On the following day, Boxing Day, several of the Murphy children attended the Mount Sylvia races at nearby cafe. It was one of those perfect Australian summer days, hot but not too oppressive, with a bright moon promised for the evening. The races were everything country racing should be. Slightly chaotic, definitely entertaining, and an excellent excuse for the community to gather. Among the Murphy children at the races were Michael, 29, home for the holidays from his work at the Westbrook Experimental Farm, where he conducted agricultural research. His sisters, Norah, 27, and Ellen, 18, accompanied him. Michael had recently left his position at Gatton Agricultural College and was building a reputation as a hard worker with a mind for innovation. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the last races concluded, Michael made a decision. There was to be a dance that evening at the Gatton Divisional Board Hall, organised by some of his friends from the Mounted Infantry. And despite their mother's reservations, Michael insisted on taking his sisters. Around 8 p.m, Michael borrowed his brother-in-law William McNeil's sulky, a light 2-wheeled cart pulled by a single horse. The sulky had a distinctive feature. One wheel wobbled, leaving tracks that were easy to identify, a detail that will become important. Michael, Norah and Ellen set off for Gatton, the evening air still warm, the approaching moon casting the landscape in silver. They were dressed in their finest. This was a rare social occasion in a farming community where entertainment was scarce. Michael even wore a suit. The girls wore dresses that had been carefully pressed. Norah, who essentially ran the household and cared for her invalid sister Polly's younger daughter, probably welcomed the break from responsibility. They arrived at the hall around 9 p.m. to find nothing. The dance had been cancelled. Too few men had turned up, someone said. It was a disappointment, but not a tragedy. Not yet. Michael, Norah and Ellen spent an hour or so strolling through Gatton streets, gossiping with friends, perhaps stopping for a drink. Dozens of people saw them. They were cheerful, relaxed, and at around 10 p.m, as the moon rose bright enough to read a newspaper by, they climbed back into the sulky and began the journey home. Multiple witnesses saw them leaving town, the 3 siblings silhouetted against the moonlit road. Some called out greetings. The Murphys waved back. It should have been an 8-mile ride home, easy, safe. The moon was so bright you could see every rut in the road, every stand of wattle trees, every fence line. But Michael, Norah and Alan Murphy would never reach home. Morning comes slowly to the Australian bush in summer. The kookaburras laugh first. Then the magpies begin their complex territorial songs, and gradually the heat builds up like a physical presence. At the Murphy farm, Daniel Sr. woke at 5 a.m. to a cold stove and an empty kitchen. No breakfast prepared, no fire lit, no sound of Norah organising the household as she did every morning. The sulky wasn't in its usual place. The horse wasn't in the yard. Perhaps they'd stayed in town, Daniel thought. Perhaps they'd stayed with friends. But as the sun climbed higher and the morning stretched on, Mary Murphy's worry deepened into something harder to dismiss. At around 8 a.m, she asked her son-in-law William McNeil to ride into Gatton to find out what had happened to her children. McNeil was a Protestant butcher, married to the Murphys' eldest daughter, Polly. Not particularly popular with their Catholic family, but available and capable. McNeil rode down the Tent Hill Road toward Gatton, his eyes scanning the ground. There, the distinctive tracks of his sulky's wobbly wheel. He followed them along the road, his initial concern beginning to crystallise into something colder. Then, about 2 miles from Gatton, the tracks veered sharply through a slip rail, a section of fence where rails could easily be removed for access, into a paddock owned by a man named Moran. McNeil guided his horse through the opening. The sulky tracks continued into the paddock, through wattle scrub and long grass, and there, perhaps 50 yards into the field, he saw them. 3 figures lying in the grass. Michael and Ellen lay back to back within 2 feet of each other, their bodies positioned with grotesque precision. Ellen's skull had been fractured by 2 massive blows to the left side of her head. Her clothing was torn. 28 feet to the east, Norah lay on a neatly spread rug soaked through with blood. Her skull had been so badly damaged that her brain protruded. She'd also been strangled. Her hands, like Ellen's, were tied behind her back with a handkerchief. All 3 victims had their legs carefully arranged, with their feet pointing west. It was a detail so specific and so deliberate that it defied explanation. This signature positioning has never been repeated in Australian criminal history. The sulky stood 17.5 feet from Michael and 36 feet from Norah, forming a rough triangle with the bodies. And between the shafts of the sulky, McNeil's horse lay dead, shot through the head. The brutality was evident, the staging was undeniable, but the why of it, the meaning behind the careful positioning, the neat rug, the feet pointing west, that was and remains a complete mystery. McNeil, in shock, made a decision that would compromise the entire investigation. Instead of riding immediately to the police station, he rode first to the Brian Boru Hotel in Gatton and burst in with the news. They're murdered, all 3 of them. Someone's murdered the Murphys. Within minutes, up to 40 men had rushed to the crime scene. They trampled evidence, moved through the paddock, touched things, contaminated everything. By the time the police actually secured the site, if you could call it that, whatever clues the killer or killers might have left had been obliterated by well-meaning neighbours and the morbidly curious. But that was just the beginning of the investigation's problems. If the Gatton murders represent a tragedy of violence, the investigation that followed was almost a dark comedy of incompetence, except there was nothing funny about 3 young people lying dead while the authorities fumbled. Acting Sergeant William Arrell was in charge of the Gatton police station. He arrived at the crime scene and immediately recognised that this was way beyond his capacity. He needed Brisbane. He needed the Criminal Investigation Branch. He needed help. Arrell tried to mark his telegram urgent, but was told he had no authority to send urgent telegrams. This was incorrect. He would later be criticised by a royal commission for not knowing his own authority and for waiting at the telegraph office instead of returning immediately to guard the crime scene. The telegram was delivered to Brisbane Police Headquarters at 12:52 p.m, but because Boxing Day was a public holiday, it sat unopened till 9 a.m. the following day. 20 hours lost, straight away. Meanwhile, back in Brisbane, Michael's brother Daniel Murphy, a police constable, received a telegram from a family friend informing him of the murders. Daniel applied for 3 days compassionate leave. It was granted. Then he just missed the 1 p.m. train to Gatton. When he returned to headquarters, he discovered that no action was being taken by the Criminal Investigation Branch. Inspector Frederick Urquhart had heard rumours that the murders were a hoax and decided it wasn't worth his attention. Let that sink in for just a moment. 3 people reported murdered. Their brother, a serving police officer, had applied for emergency leave, but their head of COB thought it might be a hoax. At 4 p.m. on December 28th, Urquhart was finally informed that the murders were indeed real. He didn't tell the Commissioner of Police for 5 hours because the information did not come through official channels. When the Commissioner finally learned what had happened and ordered Urquhart to take 2 detectives to Gatton immediately, there was a train leaving Brisbane at midnight. Urquhart and his team didn't board it. Instead, they left at 7:30 the following morning. By the time investigators arrived at the crime scene in force, 48 hours had passed since the discovery of the bodies. The scene had been trampled by dozens of people. The bodies had been moved, evidence had been destroyed or contaminated beyond recovery. But surely the medical examination would help, right? Dr. von Lossberg, the government medical officer from Ipswich, arrived at 4 p.m. on the day the bodies were discovered. He conducted what can only generously be called superficial examinations. He didn't even open the bodies properly. And by 7:30 p.m, less than 4 hours after arriving, he was back on his train, going home. Michael had been shot in the head, but von Lossberg missed the bullet entirely. Both women had been raped, possibly with objects. Their skulls were shattered. Norah had been strangled, but the examinations were so cursory that key evidence was missed or misrecorded. And then, incredibly, the local magistrates gave permission for the bodies to be buried. The following day, just 2 days after the murders. Oddly, William McNeil insisted on paying for all 3 funerals. The Murphys were buried in St Mary's Catholic Cemetery after a service attended by a shocked community. When Inspector Urquhart finally arrived and reviewed the case, even he recognised the examinations had been inadequate and the bodies were exhumed. By now, decomposition was advanced, but even through the decay, pathologists could see what had been missed. Michael had indeed been shot on the right side of his head, and then someone had struck him with a blunt instrument in exactly the same spot, partially obscuring the bullet hole. The bullet was recovered from inside his skull. The exhumation revealed more details about the violence inflicted on the women, details too disturbing to fully catalogue. This was not an opportunistic attack. This was sustained, methodical brutality. Over the following weeks, Queensland Police Service investigators collected more than 3,000 statements. They interviewed itinerant workers, family members, neighbours, anyone who might have seen or heard something. But the investigation was doomed from the start, compromised by the contaminated crime scene, the botched medical examinations, the delayed response, and perhaps something else. Something that whispered through the community like wind through wattle trees. In any small community, a crime this brutal is bound to generate theories. Some were based on evidence, others based on gossip, prejudice, or the very human need to make sense of the senseless. The police initially focused on itinerant workers, swagmen and drifters who passed through Gatton on their way to somewhere else. It was a convenient theory. The crime could be blamed on outsiders, on men with no connection to the community. Richard Burgess fit this profile perfectly. A violent criminal with a history of rape. He'd been released from prison just weeks before the murders after serving 6 months for raping an elderly woman near Toowoomba. When police arrested him in January 1899 for peculiar behaviour, they thought they'd found their man. But Burgess had an ironclad alibi. Multiple witnesses placed him nowhere near Gatton on Boxing Day. Despite his history, despite his suspicious behaviour, the evidence simply didn't support his involvement. He was released in March 1899 and left Australia shortly after. Interestingly, Burgess would spend the rest of his life boasting that he'd committed the Gatton murders. But sometimes men do lie about their crimes for the same reason they lie about anything else. For attention, for infamy, for a kind of dark significance. Then there was the man who had become the primary suspect, though he was never charged, never tried, and would die by his own hand before the full truth could emerge. Thomas Day was a butcher working for A.G. Clark in Gatton. He lived in a hut approximately 900 feet from where the murders occurred. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him walking along Tent Hill Road on the nights leading up to the crime. Unusual behaviour that drew attention. A few days after the murders, someone claimed to have seen Day washing blood from a pullover. When questioned by police, they found blood on his clothing. But in 1898, there was no way to test whether it was human or animal blood. Day, of course, claimed it was from his butchery work. His employer, Mr. Clark, warned Day not to wash a particular jumper. Day proceeded to wash and boil it twice, then scrub it with a brush. When Inspector Urquhart interviewed Thomas Day, he found him reading 14th century Italian poetry. This detail matters because of what it reveals about the investigation. According to researcher Stephanie Bennett, author of the definitive book, The Gatton Murders, Urquhart's aristocratic background shaped his judgment. Coming from an ancient Scottish family and educated at English boarding schools, Bennett argues that Urquhart truly believed, that educated people did not commit heinous crime. The fact that Day read poetry, spoke well, carried himself with a certain kind of refinement, to Urquhart, this meant Day couldn't possibly be the killer. Other constables disagreed. Sergeant Arrell, who'd been first on the scene, suspected Day strongly. But when Arrell and others tried to voice their concerns, Urquhart allegedly threatened them with termination. The head of the COB had made up his mind, and contradicting him was career suicide. Urquhart gave Thomas Day personal permission to leave the area. Day enlisted in the Australian Army in Brisbane. Then in May 1899, he deserted. Thomas Day vanished. But the suspicions around him didn't vanish. There was another murder, you see, on December the 10th, 1898, more than 2 weeks before the Murphy murders. A 15-year-old boy named Alfred Stephen Hill had disappeared while riding his pony from Nunda to visit relatives at Red Bank Plains. His body was found on January the 7th, 1899, hidden in bushland between Oxley and Darra, about 40 miles from Gatton. Alfred Hill had been shot. His pony had been shot through the forehead, exactly like McNeil's horse at the Gatton crime scene. A constable testified at the Royal Commission that he suspected Day of being involved in the Hill murder as well, and that the same revolver had been used in both the Oxley and Gatton murders. In 1906, 8 years after the crimes, a revolver with 4 spent chambers was found near the butchery where Day had worked. 4 shots, 1 for Michael, 1 for the horse, and 2 more. But by then, Thomas Day was long gone. Or was he? On October 27, 1900, a man calling himself Theo Farmer was admitted to Sydney Hospital, dying from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. When officials examined his effects, they found a rambling letter scrawled in pencil. Just a few words wishing to inform the public about the Gatton murder, which I suppose or hope will be found when I am no more. The newspapers quickly identified Theo Farmer as Thomas Day. The suicide note wasn't a confession, not explicitly, but what does it mean to write about a murder while dying from a self-inflicted gunshot? Was Day claiming he couldn't live with what he'd done, or couldn't live with what he'd seen? Some researchers believe Day witnessed the murders but didn't commit them himself, that multiple attackers were involved. The evidence of gang rape supports this. Perhaps Day was part of a group and the guilt drove him to suicide. Or perhaps he was the sole killer and the note was his way of admitting it without admitting it. We'll never know, because Thomas Day took his secrets to the grave. But Day wasn't the only person under suspicion. As the investigation dragged on without arrests, rumours began to circulate about the Murphy family. Why had they become so uncooperative with police? Why had they allegedly refused to even provide horses to aid in the search? What were they hiding? Stories emerged about Michael Murphy's personal life. Rumours claimed he'd had affairs with unmarried women in the area, that he'd fathered children out of wedlock. One particularly dark story involved a woman named Kate Ryan, who allegedly became pregnant by Michael and died in childbirth. According to gossip, Norah and Ellen had violently opposed any marriage, creating bitter enmity. Could the murders have been revenge for Michael's alleged seductions? Could angry relatives or a scorned lover have ambushed the siblings on that moonlit road? Inspector Urquhart investigated these claims and publicly declared them false. Kate Ryan, he said, was alive and married to someone else, but the whispers persisted. There was even darker speculation. Had something inappropriate been happening within the Murphy household? Was that why they were so protective of their reputation, so unwilling to cooperate with authorities? These theories had no evidence at all supporting them, but in a case with so few answers, people grasped at any explanation, no matter how speculative or cruel. The truth might be much simpler. The Murphys were Irish Catholic immigrants who clawed their way to respectability. They attended church, they kept their farm productive, they stayed out of trouble. Respectability was everything they'd worked for, everything they'd wanted for their children. And then 3 of those children were murdered in the most public, most sensational way possible. The family's private pain became a national spectacle. Reporters descended, Gawkers toured the crime scene. Every detail of the family's life was picked apart in newspapers across Australia. Is it any wonder they withdrew? Is it any wonder they wanted nothing to do with an investigation that had failed them so catastrophically? The public outrage over the Gatton investigation and another botched murder case in Oxley forced the Queensland government's hand. In July 1899, a royal commission was appointed to investigate the criminal investigation branch and the broader Queensland police force. The commission's findings were damning. Inspector Frederick Urquhart was censured for his handling of the case. The commission found the QPS suffered from a lack of cohesion and efficient organisation to enable them to cope with serious crimes in such a manner as the people of the colony are entitled to expect. Urquhart's delay in responding, his dismissal of the rumours as a hoax, his failure to inform the Commissioner for hours, his protection of Thomas Day despite evidence, all of it was documented as examples of a rotten system and culpable indifference. The Commission recommended that Urquhart be transferred out of the CIB and replaced with someone more competent. The Queensland Government offered a reward of £1,000, a substantial sum in 1898 for information leading to the apprehension and conviction of the murderer or murderers. No one has ever claimed it. Over the years, new theories have emerged. In 2013, researcher Stephanie Bennett proposed that a swagman named Joe Quinn committed the murders as revenge after Michael Murphy exposed his criminal past during an altercation in Longreach during the shearers' strike. It's a compelling theory, tremendous yarn, but like all the others, it lacks definitive proof. More recently, historian Carolyn Stevenson, in her book The Tainted Cross, The Oxley and Gatton Murders Unveiled, has argued that the Gatton murders are connected to the Oxley murder of Alfred Hill, citing 26 similarities between the cases. Again, interesting, plausible, but ultimately speculative. The truth is, after more than a century, we're no closer to knowing who killed Michael, Norah and Ellen Murphy than we were in December 1898. The town of Gatton still exists, of course. It's grown substantially, from 449 people at the census in 1901 to about 7,000 today. The Murphy farm's long gone, subdivided, developed. Moran's paddock where the bodies were found has been built over. But the case itself refuses to fade into history. Every few years someone comes forward with a new theory, a new suspect, a new explanation for the unexplainable. True crime enthusiasts make pilgrimages to Gatton. Books are written. Podcasts like this one are recorded. So what is it about this case that captures our imagination after all these years? Perhaps it's the sheer brutality combined with the bizarre staging, those feet pointing west, the neatly spread rug, the careful positioning of the bodies. These details suggest ritual, meaning, purpose. But what purpose? What could justify or explain such violence? Perhaps it's the perfect storm of incompetence that allowed a murderer to escape justice. If the crime scene hadn't been contaminated, if the medical examinations had been thorough, if Urquhart had taken the initial report seriously, if Thomas Day had been properly investigated before being allowed to leave, might the case have been solved? Michael, Norah and Ellen Murphy left that dance that never even happened in Gatton at around 10 p.m. on December 26, 1898. They should have been home by midnight. They were found the next morning in a paddock, their bodies arranged in a pattern that has never been repeated, killed for reasons we may never understand. Strewth. What happened in that paddock? And why? We may never know. And perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all, that violence this profound, this calculated, this strange, can simply happen and leave no answer behind. Thanks for listening to Strewth. Be sure to join us again next week, where we delve into another unsolved, unexplained and unbelievable Australian tale. If you've enjoyed the show, make sure you tell a friend, anyone who likes a good yarn. Like, subscribe, high five, all that sort of stuff. We really appreciate it.